Greetings, you heroically curious Herle Burlyites. Hey, I just wanted to say that I'm just chuffed you keep listening to the show. We consider it our mission to do a couple of things here on the pod. The first is to get past the headlines, sound bites, talking points, and the tweets out there on the Elonosphere and just have some intelligent conversation and debate. The second thing is to try to have a good time as we're doing it. Today, I think we're going to accomplish both objectives. We have a good friend of the pod here and a good friend of mine, Lyle, founder and president of the Innovative Research Group. If you're a regular listener, you heard Greg before as part of our pollster panel back in February. He's built his career on the intersection of public policy, communications, and public opinion. And if you're following our sister program, Curse of Politics, you know that Greg is in the field in Ontario all month long with weekly tracking of voter attitudes and preferences. We're breaking down his numbers on that show on pretty much a daily basis. But here, today, on the Herle Burly, recorded on the day the writ drops, we're going to set the table for the Ontario election. If there's any kind of horse race, where the hell is it? Can Ford be assailed at all? What do people think about each of the leaders? Ford, Horwath, Duca, Schreiner. There's been a couple of early policy announcements already. Where are people's heads at when it comes to policy? Cover all that and more. Greg, I'm really happy to have you here, not just in the form of your data, but as a person. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. How are you and where are you?
I'm out in Vancouver at an energy conference. I'm doing well.
Excellent. Okay. So I know you super well, but let's presume our listeners do not. Brag for yourself a little bit. What's your background in this business? Tell us about your experience.
So I started out in politics, as is just like you, and I had a lucky break when I was 25. I became principal secretary, which is in those days and places, principal secretary of Manitoba, which was a combination of the senior political advisor and the chief of staff in the premier's office to the PC premier of Manitoba, Gary Filmon, during Meech Lake. And so that really put me in the cat seat. I had been a Mulroney delegate, and of course he was the prime minister. I had worked for Premier Bill Bennett, and Norman Spector was the prime minister's chief of staff, but previously had been Bill Bennett's deputy minister. I had been active across the country, so I knew a lot of these people. The attorney general for BC had been his body man in a leadership race. So, So that really exposed me to the world. And in part of that job, I was the client for the PC party and for the Manitoba government for all the research we did because I had some exposure to it at university. So I met Alan Gregg. I actually fired Alan Gregg in 1988 because he sort of let us down in the 88 election. But then he called me back in 91 when I was leaving the premier's office and made a joke about my black heart, and then asked did I want to work with Decima. So I spent several years working with Alan Gregg at Decima. Then I spent a few years working with Angus Reid, and then went out on my own. And so there were a couple iterations of it, but eventually in 2004, we created the standalone research firm Innovative Research Group. We're 20 or so people with offices in Toronto and Vancouver. And actually in my day-to-day work, I do almost no politics anymore. But it's how we promote ourselves in the research business. So we do, when elections roll around, we do a lot of work. And I do it the way I would have if I was running a campaign.
And what does that mean? Roll right into that.
Sure. So what I'm not just interested in who's voting for who today. I want to know what's driving that and what you can do about it, whether you're the Liberals, the NDP, or the Tories, or, for instance, New Blue. And so I look for some basics. So the first thing I look for is the political equivalent of brand. That in political science is something called brand identity. In marketing, we call it brand affinity. But it's the answer to the question, is there a party you feel closer to? And if so, what is that? And a lot of people think that you may have heard pundits talking about the idea that people are detached from parties these days. And that just isn't true. If you are actively following politics, if you are a regular voter, it's just like if you like to watch baseball. If you like to watch baseball, you've got a favorite team. right? There's no one that sits down and has like a checklist to decide what their favorite team will be this year, right? You're a Blue Jays fan or you're whatever. And so with politics, most people identify with a party. And I'm sure most of your viewers and listeners have heard of something called confirmatory bias. It is a key driver of how people consume political information. So if I feel like a liberal and I read a story that a journalist would say was objective and balanced about the three parties, when I read it, I'm going to see a pro-liberal story. Because I'm basically going to look for the good stuff about the liberals and ignore the bad stuff about the liberals. And this really happens. Like when you test copy, the first time through, generally speaking, the average bit of copy is tested pretty well. Then we make people go through with red pens and green pens, green for good and red for bad. And that forces them to attend to the things that their mind told them to ignore the first time through. And then how people feel about that information changes. But that's not how the real world works. In the real world, we ignore the red pen stuff and just focus on the green. So that's number one. Number two, and by the way, there was a huge change.
Hold on. Let's not get into data yet.
Okay. So we'll come back. Second thing I look at is how people feel about the government. Right? Because to a degree, every election includes something of a referendum on how the government's been going. So again, in political science, that's called retrospective voting. In politics, we use a question called time for change. Now, we do our time for change a little bit differently. And this was actually driven out of my experience in Alberta, which was the last set of elections I did politically. So I started off working for Ed Stelmach, then for Alison Redford, and then for Jim Prentice. And in those campaigns, there was a key group that we really cared about that caused me to reconsider how I did time for change. And the second question that we use to measure time for change, in addition to agree, disagree, is time for change, is agree, disagree, the party in government may have its problems, but it's the best option to form the government, the lesser of evil questions, I call it. And when you combine those two things, you get these time for change government supporters. They're people that say it's time for change, but they still think the party in charge is the lesser of evil for all of its flaws. So that's really critical. And then
that had to be true for Kathleen to win in 2014.
Yeah, in 2014, she wowed the time for change people. Christy Clark, in her first election in BC, wowed the time for change people. And so the last thing that we look at as a regular thing, but there are lots of other stuff that we'll talk about, is how people feel about leaders.
Right.
And one thing just to bear in mind is that if you have a favorite team, right? So if you're driven by brand loyalty, by party, then leadership's not so important to you. But if you're conflicted, and many people are conflicted in many ways about how they feel about parties, often you will end up focusing on leaders. And people that are less engaged in politics, so those sort of marginal voters that may show up or may not show up, they are disproportionately influenced by leadership. And and they make up their minds later in the campaign. So the longer this campaign goes, the more important leadership is going to be.
Do people ever, Greg, vote for a party to form the government when they don't think the leader would be the right person to be the premier?
Sure. The follow-up to that question is how much do they like the other leaders, right? And so one thing that'll be interesting in this campaign is Andrea Horwath, right? This is her fourth go. The first three times, every time she fought an election, she went up in her favorables, every time. I'm not doing this campaign, but in previous campaigns, we've tested the ads as part of the process. And, her ads, where it's her straight to the camera, this is what I believe, consistently tested among the best of any political ad I've tested. She just, in the past, has connected with Ontarians very effectively. So, if you really are attracted to a party, a leader of another party, then you create potential defectors. But if you don't like your leader, but you don't like the rest either, a pox on all their house. And in this particular poll, all the leaders' negatives went up.
Right.
Then you're a lot more likely to vote for a party.
Okay, so let's get into the data. But first, because there's nerds out there that will question everything that we say today, everything you say in particular. So quickly, what's the methodology here? How was this survey conducted?
Sure.
And when?
Yeah, this is an online poll, a representative online poll. So we set quotas for age and gender by region. So that, and we actually set quotas by 9 regions. So the 2016 U.S. election campaign, one of the reasons that it was off was because when they were doing national polling, they'd set quotas by states, but it turned out within states they were getting too many urban and not enough rural. And the big change in that election were the rural voters going to Trump, and non-voting rural voters voting. And so we always had regional, but we were even more focused on getting regional right.
Right. And just done right now, right? Came out of the field yesterday?
Yeah, came out of the field on Monday morning.
Okay. So what's the mood of the electorate going into this election campaign?
I would say they're a bit grumpy. There are not a lot of people enthralled with their current preference at the moment. They have conflicted views about these people. Everyone that would say that, leader X is best and I prefer party Y, most of those people can tell you something they don't like about that leader and something they don't like about that party. And so there's a fair amount of compromise going on. I think the other thing is that this is not starting as one of the highest engagement elections. So generally, people get more involved when they're really mad at the government. And, there's a significant group of people that fundamentally dislike this government and this premier and are upset at the things that they're doing. But, compared to Kathleen Wynne, it's, the second election, it's not like that. It's not like when Kim Campbell was defeated. It's not that type of overwhelming anger and frustration.
Right. But is there enough time for a change sentiment there for the government to lose?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. So right now, the government is sort of halfway between Kathleen Wynne's first election and Kathleen Wynne's second election. So when you look at it just in a time for change perspective, if the frame was this is a referendum on the government's behavior, you would expect to see a closer race than we're seeing. The government right now, if you look at, we have a time for change segmentation, and we'll have that posted by the time this podcast comes out so people can take a look. The Tories are really efficient. They are winning a lot of support compared to what we would normally see in every segment of that time for a change mix. So well over half the people that say it's time for a change, but I think the Tories are best, are voting for the Tories right now. And normally at this point in the campaign, that wouldn't even hit 50%. Another way of looking at that, though, is that efficiency means they're at a high watermark. It's very unlikely they can go further with the attitudes that exist on time for a change. That's going to be a limiting factor on them. So I think a key dynamic in this race for the opposition is going to be to drive up anger at time for a change. So, for instance, if they can do a clever ad around the Steiny Brown press conference in February 2021, and then the government's handling of COVID following that, Steiny Brown basically released a projection of where COVID was going to go in February that said by April, thousands of people will be dying unnecessarily if we don't clamp down, we don't add restrictions. The government essentially ignored that. They might argue with us, but if you look at the track record, they did not add restrictions. They reduced restrictions. And sure enough, by the beginning of April, they had to reverse course. Police powers, you can't go to a park, things like that, and then had to adjust again. So, the opposition needs to get people angry. The government, on the other hand, the good news for the government, as you well know, is that before an election, governments are measured against the perfect, but in an election, they're measured against the alternative. And so the job of the government is basically to say, you think we're bad, look at these guys. We're a walk in the park compared to them. And so what they need to do is do that contrast of, we may have our problems, but we're way better than these other guys.
We're at the beginning of May. Flora is finally starting to bloom in most of the country. So this seems like the right time to be talking about a thing called pollinator. The presenting sponsor of our podcast is TELUS. You all know that. And if you've been following along with this story thread on TELUS's ESG commitments, environmental, social, and governance, you also know that they're a company driven by social purpose. To use their world-leading technology for good and put the well-being of their customers, communities, and the planet first. So, TELUS has a pollinator fund for good. At $100 million, it's one of the world's largest corporate impact funds. Its mission is to power the bravest and boldest ideas by for-profit startups dedicated to social innovation and building tech for good. The fund is just in its first year, but so far the team has closed 10 investments totaling almost $20 million, partnering with sustainable small businesses who tackle some of the biggest social, economic, healthcare, and environmental challenges of our generation. 40% of these companies are led by women. 50% are headed by Indigenous and racialized leaders. In all cases, the Pollinator Fund connects these companies to the skills, expertise, money, and even the networking connections they need to scale and grow. I'm going to dive into one of these 10 investment stories later this week, Herle Burlyites, and how perfect for a fund called Pollinator. It's about the health of honeybees and cutting-edge beekeeping technology. But right now, I invite you to read more about TELUS's commitments in their sustainability and ESG report at telus.com/sustainability. So, unveil, what's the top line? What's the vote? If the election was today, how would it have gone?
Well, you have to tell me you're going to ask me this. So there's two ways of answering that question. So the first way that everyone expects is what we call decided vote. So if we factor out the undecided, what's the vote? And this is what you'll see in all the newspapers and on TV. And so that has the Tories at 37%, the Liberals at 29%, and the NDP at 24%. So a good 8-point lead for the Tories, which is a pretty big lead to blow. But people have done it. And if you work hard, you can. And the NDP struggling to catch up with the Liberals, but not out of the race at 24%. But that's a little bit misleading because if you look at that chart, what you'll see is that the blue line goes up from, say 32% in the last survey to 37 now. But if you go back to an earlier slide, you'll see what we call the raw vote, where we also show the undecided. And when you look at that chart, the Tories are only up a point. They're at 33%, and they were 32 or 31 before. The Liberals have been slipping over the past couple of months, and they are down 3 or 4 points in this poll. And the NDP have also been slipping. So if the Tories aren't up and the other two parties are slipping, what's going on? A bunch of people have gone to the fence, 14%. And, there's a big question for the Tories of how much of that undecided can they actually get. And since it came from the Liberals and the NDP, and we know that with the Liberals and the NDP, generally speaking, each has the other as their second choice by and large. Not a lot of them have the Tories as their second choice. And in particular, not a lot of New Democrats have the Tories as their second choice. What will likely happen is that as the election goes further, that undecided will come down. And when it comes down, it will mostly be a primary between the Liberals and the NDP and not a race that includes the Tories.
And if you were to handicap this, how likely do you think it is that the Liberals and the NDP end up splitting pretty evenly 60% of the vote? Or how likely do you think it is that the anti-Ford vote will ultimately consolidate behind one of those two alternatives?
So I think what's going to happen in the first 10 days is that the Tories and the NDP are going to dust off the ads we saw last fall and go after Del Duca, because both of them have their major competitor being the Liberals. And Del Duca goes in this election with almost half the public not knowing who he is. And we all know that the law of the jungle is eat and be eaten, that the law of politics is define or be defined. And so there's going to be a race to define Del Duca. We have spending limits, and twice as much money is going to be spent on negative messages as positive messages. And we know that historically, negative messages are retained sort of 3 times as much as positive. So, if experience is a guide, Del Duca's in big trouble, really big trouble. And when his numbers go down, if in turn Andrea Horwath does as she's done in the past and picks up positives, it's quite possible that the NDP can get ahead of the Liberals. The problem that the NDP have right now is that most people believe this is a 2-horse race and that the NDP doesn't really have a chance. Much more now than in the last election where the NDP almost won. So, let's see what happens at the end of 10 days. Let's see who gets to define Del Duca. One of the threats for the NDP is that there's one thing different about Andrea Horwath in this election than we've seen in previous elections. And that difference is after 4 years of serving as the leader of the opposition, a lot of people see her as a negative politician. They didn't see her that way before. They see her like that now. And so their challenge is to attack without driving up the negatives. Now, that's possible. So if you think about the 2015 federal election and you think about the Liberal ads, both the one where Trudeau was walking in front of Parliament and then the one where Trudeau was going up the escalator, people perceive those ads as being positive. But if you read the script, they're trashing Stephen Harper and the Conservatives, just trashing them. But they don't come across that way. They come across as, we have this problem, and I'm going to fix it, and I'm on your side. So if the NDP can take that type
Gerald Butts's formulation was, we're not negative like those other assholes.
Yeah, exactly. And it worked like a charm. I mean, honestly, I mean, there are very few campaigns where you can say the third place party went the first, right? That's one. Mike Harris in 1995 is another. I can't immediately pick a third, right? So it's a hard thing to do. Now, again, we talked about confirmatory bias before. The initial job of the Liberals in 2015 was to convince Liberals to vote Liberals, right? They were low. They had a bunch of defectors going to the NDP, so they needed to bring the defectors home. And, with confirmatory bias, that's a much easier challenge than the NDP's challenge in Ontario today, which is to get people that don't feel like New Democrats to vote New Democrats. So they have to leave the place they feel comfortable, accept information from a party they don't feel close to, and vote for them. And again, they almost pulled it off last time. I really don't think people appreciate how remarkable the NDP campaign was in the last election. It was really a remarkable accomplishment. And it was like, there's a book about the Gerald Ford presidential campaign called We Almost Made It, right? And that's the story of the NDP campaign. And given where they started, it was a remarkable accomplishment.
Why are the Conservatives winning? Why are 39% or 37%? I think I said 39 on the Curse of Politics because I think I read the slide that way, Greg. But why are 37 to 39% of Ontarians voting for the Conservatives? What do they like about what they've seen? Well,
it comes down to Doug Ford. So we're seeing something completely unique in this election. I can't recall ever seeing it before. Maybe you can. But we have a situation where there's a premier that's been in power for 4 years. And normally what happens at the end of 4 years is how I feel about the party, how I feel about the leader, how I feel about the government all merges together. And if you have, so we have a tool based on the linear mathematical model called a regression, and we control one thing and vary all the others, see what makes a difference. And, when we do that sort of work, we typically find that the measure of government, the measure of party loyalty, and the measure of how I feel about the premier all roll together. But they don't in Ontario today. Doug Ford has a brand that's distinct from the Tory brand. And you and Jenny had an exchange about this when you were talking about the Yes Express, and you said that doesn't sound like a Tory slogan. And Jenny says, you're right, but it's a Doug Ford slogan. And so what's happening right now is that, depending on the poll, somewhere between 13% and 18% of the electorate are people that don't feel like Tories, but like Doug Ford. And if you look at our crosstabs, which are in the deck that we will post, those crosstabs show that the Tories are winning the majority of those voters. People that don't feel like Tories, but they're voting Tory because they want to get Doug Ford. So that's why they're doing as well as they are, because they've been able to add a bunch of non-Tories to the Tory base and expand their pool. So there's a risk there. And I'll remind everyone of another campaign, because the people that listen to this probably all read John Duffy's book. But the campaign I'm thinking about right now is the 1988 free trade election. And so the free trade election did not evolve the way the Tories expected. They went in with a ballot question of who's best to manage change, and all of a sudden it became an issue-based election, and they weren't expecting it. And what they found was that there was a bridge that was holding us all together for the Liberals, and that bridge was John Turner. And so they decided to bomb the bridge. And that's clearly what the Liberals have to do in this election. They have to bomb the bridge that is Doug Ford. They have to remind people have mixed views of Doug Ford, they have mixed views of everything. They have to remind people the things that they don't like about Doug Ford, to have his numbers go down. And to get those people, remember we were talking about confirmatory bias. So what do we know about that 13 to 18% that are non-PC Doug Ford supporters? Well, we know they're conflicted because they don't feel like Tories. And so, if a party they feel like tells them, reminds them of something they already know about Doug Ford that they don't like and makes it relevant, and that's critical. Like, you can tell them something and they'll just slough it off. It's got to cause you to stop and think. And we know right now. So that whole idea of, are people ready to stop and think? The way that we consider politics is that we're busy people. We don't study it. We don't create a spreadsheet. We read all the platforms. We come to an initial judgment. And that's called satisficing. Have I heard enough to make up my mind? Or do I feel like I need to hear more? Well, right now in Ontario, about 60% of the electorate says, I think I need to hear more before I make up my mind. So most of them have a preference. But they aren't sure it's going to be their final choice. Now, a big chunk of those people won't hear enough to change their mind, and they'll end up voting for the party they feel like right now. But some of them will hear something that changes their mind. And so the job of the NDP and the Liberals is to get people to stop and listen to what they're saying. And typically that means it's got to be better than just name calling.
So, this past weekend, spring may actually have arrived. Well, at least there was no snow. And in Ottawa on Sunday, thousands of people turned out in the sunshine on their bicycles and on foot to support cancer care and research at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. Really, it's hard to imagine a better cause than that. The ride is an annual event, and our sponsor, CN, is a driving force. The railway contributed $150,000 this year, and as always, matches individual donations from its employees and pensioners. The Hospital Foundation describes the event as critically important in allowing CHEO to deliver vital care to children with cancer. The CN cycle for CHEO has in fact raised more than $10 million since the ride was launched 15 years ago. And it's just one of a slew of local initiatives CN is part of across the country. Yes, moving heavy cargo is the main job, but CN's railroaders are also on the ground, helping out in communities across its 1,000 miles of network in Canada and in the US. At the core of it is CN's Stronger Communities Fund, an effort through which CN funds nonprofit community organizations and education. The main goals are support of innovation, diversity and inclusion, environmental work, and the promotion of health and safety. As well, CN provides logistical support and financial incentives to its thousands of active railroaders and pensioners, who have a remarkable collective record of volunteering and donation. As well, CN provides logistical support and financial incentives to its thousands of active railroaders and pensioners, who have a remarkable collective record of volunteering and donation. Over the past 10 years, CN employees and pensioners have raised $17.1 million, supporting causes as varied as assistance to victims of wildfires and flooding, charities like United Way, children's health initiatives, and most recently, Help for the People of Ukraine, a cause both a railway and its employer groups strongly support. Put simply, CN believes public service is an absolute good. We'll be talking more about the subject here in the weeks to come. Meanwhile, if you want to help pitch in or learn a little more about what CN is doing for its neighbors along the network, take a minute and go to cn.ca/community. What do you think the Ford soft underbelly is?
I think there are two. If you look at the history of all the times we saw bad things come up over the past 4-year government, we ask a question every week. Have you read, seen, heard anything about Doug Ford and the PC government? What was it that leave you feeling more or less favorable? And there are two core things that consistently knocked the Tories off. One was allegations of corruption. Right, and that was particularly strong for the first year and a half when Dean French was running things, where there were a bunch of appointments and contracts and things. And so every time that happened, Doug Ford's numbers went down and the vote went down. So the question is, there's pressure in question period to get all your ammo out and to put the government on the defensive. But if people got brown envelopes and put them aside and saved them, which you should do, but it's just so pressing and urgent to win tomorrow's headline that often you don't. So that would be one way to get it. The other way is his bad days on COVID, of which there were many. And if you can get people to make that relevant again, and COVID might do it for you, right? So if you think about the federal election campaign, the rising level of COVID in the last 10 days of the campaign forced the campaign, whether it wanted to or not, to deal with the issue of COVID. Now, as it happened, it was really good for the Liberals and they ran with it. They knew that talking about COVID would blow apart the Conservative coalition, so they were all over it. So events here could really help the Liberals.
So I want to get to the issues, but I want to take a slight detour before we get there and have you give us a little tutorial on both how much attention people pay to politics in Ontario and brand affinity and how it works. And the example I'm going to use to tee you off on this is that you asked people why they're voting, how they're voting. And the largest number, and it may be half if going from recall, who are voting Conservative, cited low spending and low deficit and smaller deficits, right? Now, this is the biggest spending government in Ontario history. It has run the biggest deficits in Ontario history, and it continues to, on the base of its last budget, run deficits much larger than it needs to because it's keeping spending up. Where do people get the impression that this government cares about spending and deficits?
That's the beauty of brands, right? So brands are the legacy of everything people have experienced from a party in the past. And so when people look at what parties do, there's a belief that all else being equal, Conservatives will be quicker to try and save a nickel than the Liberals, and the Liberals more likely to do that than the NDP. And so, so people, this is the confirmatory bias thing. So I have an image of a party. And if I read a story that says that the Tories are thinking about spending cuts, I'm going to automatically believe that because that's the history of my experience with that party. If I read a story that says the Tories are reckless spenders, that may not even break through for me because I'm going to go, that makes no sense. I'm not going to pay attention to that. And so, you know, trying to get people to pay attention to news that runs against the brand is just really difficult. It's just like, let's for argument's sake, say we had a panel of health experts and they looked at the three parties' plans and they were convinced that the Tory party was the best plan on healthcare. No one would believe it, right? The assumption would be that Tommy Douglas created healthcare, and so the NDP must have the best plan on healthcare. Then the Liberals would be next. Then the Tory plan can't be any good. And there's just, so that's all about priming, right? So one thing that parties do, because we know the parties have these legacy images, what each of the party is trying to do is draw attention to issues that they do well on. So for the NDP, they're going to want to draw attention to things like social justice issues, right? For the Liberals, their only issue left to them is education. They need to make this an education election, which will be difficult. And for the Tories, it's things like jobs and cost of living and balancing the budget.
Okay,
but I just want to share one story because a lot of people may not know it. So there will be people listening to this podcast who will remember the 2003 provincial election in Ontario. Ernie Eves running against Dalton McGuinty. And there was a moment in that campaign that had the Tory war room in a complete panic. The Fraser Institute came out with a report saying that Ernie Eves was lying about his deficit. He claimed he had a balanced budget. In actual fact, there was a $5 billion deficit. And so the Tories assumed people would look at that and say, Tories are bad financial managers and their numbers would drop. What actually happened for the next 3 days is the Tory numbers went up because a bunch of people decided that the deficit was a problem. And if the deficit was a problem, even though the Tories made it, who was best to fix it? The same people that made the problem.
That's an awesome story. Thanks. So you did a deep dive on issues. What do Ontarians want this election to be about? What are they looking to the parties to talk to them about?
It's overwhelmingly an issue about an election about affordability. People are really concerned about rising prices and our ability to keep up with that. This has been strategically important, you know, for at least the last 7 years. Again, I mean, if you think about that 2015 federal election and the escalator ad, Justin Trudeau was speaking directly to those people that want to get ahead but are struggling. And we look at that as a segmentation. And we have this group that we called strugglers, middle-class strugglers, who believe you can be anything you want in this province, but aren't getting there themselves. And they're looking for a helping hand. And that's all about affordability. And so this buck or ride thing that the Liberals came out with, I don't know exactly how it's been received yet. We'll have a sense of that next week. But can
I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
So whether it's Ford giving you $500 rebate on your driver's license or Del Duca saying buck a ride on transit or whatever it is that kind of little nugget that what people are looking for when they say affordability, or are they saying I need to make $30 an hour, not $16 an hour?
It's both parts of that. Up until now, concerns about wages keeping up have not been the key issue. Last time we had inflation, it was a big issue, and it's quite possible it will come back. But I think the bigger issue here is that it's not about the policy. And so one of the things that you shared on the first podcast is that in our Red C and Herd data for the last month of the government, we found that the government announcements on affordability were actually backlashing. And so it's really important to understand that issues are not about policies. Issues are about character, right? Every issue is a character test to prove whether or not you're on my side. And so a critical issue here is sincerity, authenticity, a lot of people frame it as. And so the question is, when Stephen Del Duca promises $1 a ride, do I see that as Stephen Del Duca understands the problems of people like me? And even if I don't personally take a bus or a GO train or whatever, he gets the struggle of people like me are. And if he helped those people, maybe he'll help me. Or are people going to look at it and say, what a crass politician, pandering to me, trying to bribe me with my own money? And, there's no predicting how that ball is going to bounce. It has a lot to do with what people see in video images, right? So it used to all be about what they saw on the 6 o'clock news. Now it's as much about what they see in videos that are shared in social media. But if they look that politician in the eyes and they say, here's a guy trying to fool me that he cares, then the announcement will work against them. If they look at that person's eyes and they say he really cares. And that's the remarkable thing about Doug Ford. So again, something just I've never seen before, and I'll probably never see again. When we ask people what leader cares the most about people like me, the answer is normally someone on the left, right? So that was Kathleen Wynne for most of the time she was premier, Andrea Horwath most of the rest of the time. Today in Ontario, it's Doug Ford, the Conservative. And I can't ever recall a poll I've done where the Conservative leader was seen as more caring. They can try and close the gap, but being more caring than the leaders to the left, you just don't see that. And that is a reflection of how people felt about how he handled COVID. There was a real sense in a lot of the things that he did and said that even if this guy fumbles, he is trying hard and he really cares and he feels it when he fails. And that's the big reason why we're in the race we're in with the Tories, where and Doug Ford is the bridge that is bringing non-Tories into the Tory camp.
Okay. So your poll showed that cost of living was overwhelmingly the issue.
Right.
And the only other issue in the game at all was healthcare.
Right.
And all other issues were pretty marginal, of interest to a small number of people. And when I looked at your open-ended responses to why people were voting the way they were or thinking the things they did, I saw very little reference to COVID.
Yeah.
Where has COVID gone as an issue? For example, we were talking on The Curse this morning. I was expressing surprise at how few people in your survey cared about education.
Right.
And education was an enormous issue for 2 years during COVID, and the government was right square in the spotlights every day on what was happening in classrooms and what the plan was, and annoying parents to no end with various schedule changes. Where's it gone?
So COVID is now in the brand, right? So the summary judgment of all of people's experience in COVID is worked into the premier and the government's brand, one way or the other, right? So there are a large number of people that really dislike Doug Ford and the government for the way they handled COVID. But the issue right now is that, we've sort of come to terms with COVID as endemic, as something that is here and we have to live with. If there's a new variant that starts putting people back in hospitals and putting them into ICUs and eventually large number of people dying, COVID will be back, and then we'll have that debate about restrictions again. And it's going to be a lot more complicated than it was 6 months ago. But in the absence of that, that's past, that's history. And, some people will vote. That's why we ask the questions about time for change. Some people will vote as if the election was a referendum on the record of the government. But most people will vote on what are they going to do for me now, or who do I trust to to run the job.
But wait, so interestingly, you found that very few people think any of these parties, if they were to form the government, would make a positive difference in their lives. And in fact, every one of the parties had a net negative on that response.
Sure. So in part, that's not a surprise, right? Because we know even a really popular government with a big mandate, that would be, if they were lucky, 42%, which means 58% didn't vote for them. And so there's always going to be more people that have a negative than a positive view. But there's very few people that have a strongly positive view of any party on that measure. And the Tories are the worst on it. And so part of that is because people already have, if you perceive a Tory government as giving you benefits, then the question is, do you think they'll give you more benefits? You might say, well, no, I think it'll be the same because I'm already getting the benefits I want. So some of that might just be an incumbent deflator, if I can put it that way. Whereas with the other parties, it would be a change from where things are now. And so you don't get that deflator in there. But this is the big issue for all the parties. And does it make this election more of a jump ball than it seems from the top line? Well, every election is more of a jump ball than people think. So this satisficing question is a really big deal. So, we're starting this election and 60% of the electorate says, I'd like to hear more information before I make up my mind. But the story of most elections, driven in large part by confirmatory bias, is I didn't hear anything that would cause me to change my mind, in part because, unbeknownst to me, I edit all the information I'm receiving to confirm the decision I've already made. So that's the challenge for the parties, all three of them, and the Greens and New Blue and all the rest, is to get people to stop and think. And that is surprisingly difficult. And it's not because people are dumb. It's because they're busy. And so satisficing is
Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and slow.
Yeah, it's all that. It is all that. It's great that that's accessible. Yeah. So let's get to the leaders. What do people think about the three leaders or the four leaders? Let's include Schreiner in this because he's active and campaigning. So what do people think about the four leaders? So this has been volatile. So for the past couple months, Andrea Horwath had more favorables than Doug Ford, but Doug Ford has now shifted back ahead. And part of that is that the negative winds of public debate driven by COVID restrictions and the debate around that. Like my mug. But so talking about how people feel about the leaders, basically Doug Ford was suppressing his favorables in a reaction to COVID in the last little while. Now that's behind him. His favorables are coming back up. So he and Ford and Horwath both have very similar profiles in that they have lots of favorables. They have even more negatives. And with Ford, he's got both. He's got more of both. And then you've got down below, you have Stephen Del Duca, the new Liberal leader, where the really defining thing about him is the large number of people, now just under half, but up until even just a month or so ago, more than half, saying they don't know what to think of him. And we've already talked about that a key part of this election is going to be deciding who he is. When we dig deeper, though, and we get into these... it's not unusual, though, because, Ontario's not Manitoba or Alberta. I find that Ontario provincial politics has maybe the third most share of mind of the three levels of politics in Ontario. Yeah. Whereas in Manitoba, provincial politics would be the most important form of politics going on. I think it gets the third amount of mind share in Ontario. Well, I actually think that's true of every province in Canada. I think that if you look at what's in the news, the provincial government is a lot more likely to be in the news, and particularly the news people read, right? So local newspapers are local, right? So municipal and provincial is going to get more precedence than the federal. And provincial governments run the services we receive. The federal government kicks some money into those services. and deals with issues that we don't deal with, right? So, immigration, the average person doesn't deal with. National defense, the average person doesn't deal with. Monetary policy, apparently even the prime minister doesn't really like spending much time on it. So they just not dealing with the schools your kids go to, the hospitals you go to when you're sick, any of those sort of things. So they just don't have the same presence. It's absolutely true. But in Ontario, in most places in Canada, the provincial government is based in the biggest city, right? Or one of the bigger cities if you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan. But in Ontario, even though it is based in the largest city, Toronto, it just doesn't get the same share of mind. What happened at City Hall gets way more play than what happened at Queen's Park.
So it's just not that unusual for an opposition leader not to be well known going into.
Oh, but that's true everywhere, right? I mean, the reality is that if you're looking for Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility, just go to the leader's office of the leader of the opposition. That's where it is. And it's even worse now because in COVID, nobody cared about what the opposition leader had to say. People cared about what the science table had to say, which effectively seemed to be the leader of the opposition for much of the pandemic. But the premier is news in COVID. The government is making decisions, and what the opposition might have done if they'd been empowered, just not relevant to the news.
So the NDP, such a puzzle. They are the official opposition, have been for 4 years. And the Liberals haven't even been really a presence in the legislature. So there's been a 4-year free run. Horwath's numbers are not bad, as you say. They're certainly not as bad as people think that they are. There may be some negative elements of her profile, but her numbers are not bad. They have clear ownership over all of the issues on the left side of the spectrum, on the social side of the spectrum, clear ownership over those issues, many of which are very important to people, including healthcare. They're facing a Liberal Party that hasn't had any money to create a name for itself, has a leader nobody knows, and isn't sort of somebody that's catching fire in the province. And yet here they are. Here they are having fallen back to third place in the polls. I'm not writing them off by any stretch of the imagination. But just as a starting proposition, I'm sure that they're extraordinarily frustrated by how they end up in this position. Do you have an explanation as to how they end up in this position?
Yeah, and we've already been talking about it. And the issue for them is party ID. So right now in Ontario, 29% of the electorate feel like Liberals, 27% of the electorate feel like Tories, and 13% feel like New Democrats. And in part, that's due to the value structure of Ontario. So, there's a key division on equality, on what matters to us in terms of equality that's fundamental to the modern age. And, some people say what matters is that you have equality, that you have a fair chance to get ahead, but whether you get ahead or not is on you. Other people say that the priority should be equality of results. The NDP stands for equality of results. That is the minority point of view in Canada. And so, by their fundamental positioning, the NDP is a minority party. And just doesn't start out with a lot of people feeling like New Democrats. And so that's where confirmatory bias kicks in. It comes back to that again and again. In the normal course of events, they wouldn't be 5 points behind the Liberals. They would be half of where the Liberals are. And so I really feel like there's when you see the NDP within 5 points of the Liberals, it's quite an accomplishment. It's actually quite a feat. And the fact that in the last election they won a lot of seats wasn't particularly because of them. It was really because of the Liberals, right? They
ran a bad campaign, didn't they? They ran a bad campaign. It was poorly thought. The Liberals. It was poorly thought through. No, the Liberals ran a bad campaign in the last election, right? Poorly thought through, badly executed, right? I'm joking. I'm not joking. I'm joking, not joking.
I know. But the truth is that from my read of the numbers in January, before that election was even called, before the Tories had even picked a leader, it was clear in our numbers that Ontarians had tuned out the Liberals, that there was almost nothing that the Liberals could do or say that would get people to reconsider, right? So if in that election, you almost had to ask two questions about satisfaction, which is, have you heard enough to make up your mind about the Liberals? And have you heard enough to make up your mind about the other parties? Because almost everyone had heard enough to make up their minds about the Liberals well before the writ was even dropped. So, you know, that I'm amazed you guys got out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, some days. Anyway, some days I did. Despite the NDP being behind the Liberals, you still see an easier path for a deep run into the playoffs by the NDP than you do for a deep run into the playoffs by the Liberals. Tell me why.
Well, I think the NDP strategy picks itself, right? So the first phase of an NDP campaign is to rally the people that are alienated by the way Ontario works. People that say, I can't get ahead. The system is rigged against me. And they are doing that.
Pierre Poilievre's message, you mean?
Pardon?
Pierre Poilievre's message, you mean?
Well, Bernie's message, right? Bernie Sanders' messages, AOC's message, right? Naomi Klein's message. The progressive populist critique against the elites, not the conservative critique against the elite, although those critiques can meet from time to time. So that's job number one, is to get groups like so we have the value clusters, we have this group called the core left, we have these economic clusters, we talked about the struggling middle class, but there's also this economically alienated vote. And the problem that the NDP have right now is that while they're winning those segments, they're not winning them by enough, right? And if they can move to the left of the Liberals and move and get the angrier vote, be seen as a clear voice of that angry vote, but they have to do it in a way that doesn't reinforce this new weakness of Andrea Horwath, which is that she's seen as too negative. So she has to do it the way Justin Trudeau did the escalator ad, which is, you know, be seen as the clear voice of that frustration without being seen as a negative person. And so that's not simple, but it's perfectly doable. And if they can do that, they could get ahead of the Liberals. And then once they're ahead of the Liberals, then the second step is to move that attitude about whether it's a two-horse race or whether the NDP really have a shot. And once they get that, then they get close. And then the last phase of their campaign is the who do you want, the Tories or the NDP, where they have to beat that. So the Tories have already anticipated this, right? So I've already told you that what is one of the big different things about Andrea Horwath is that she's seen as being too negative. What did they call the Tory bus? The Yes Express. It's actually anticipating the last week of a campaign at which the NDP have done a flanking move and have overtaken the Liberals. And the math is hard. I mean, how often can you actually see in a campaign that they're like 3 moves ahead?
Oh, I know.
That is remarkable.
They've done a good job of planning this and laying it out by the looks of it, for sure. But the math is difficult for the NDP to do that.
It's really hard.
As I read, because for every 10 votes that the NDP peel off the Liberals, say they went negative on Del Duca, 10 votes leave the Liberals, right? About 7 of them go to the NDP and about 6 or 7 go NDP, 3 or 4 go Conservative.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
You peel 10 votes off the NDP, 9 of them go Liberal.
Yeah.
Okay? So a lot of votes have to leave the Liberals before the NDP are catching the Tories, because they're catching them at a 7-3, 6-4 race, right?
Right. But and again, I mean, so if you think about the Liberal plan, I mean, if they can just muddle through and stay ahead of the NDP, then the last 10 days is all about don't waste your vote on the NDP, vote for us to stop Doug Ford. And, you know, all else being equal, they will close the gap with the Tories. And so the Tories have to know that and have to be concerned about that. So just like the Liberals want to bomb the bridge of Doug Ford, as will the NDP should they get close by the end of the campaign. That's why for the Tories it's so critical to Brandel Duca to sort of essentially crater his opportunity and let the NDP get ahead, and then they can reap the remaining second choice people that they've got and keep the conflicted people that they took from the Liberals already.
One of the underlying complications we haven't got to yet is the fact that the Innovative Survey says that this is a close three-way race in Toronto.
Yes.
And not a close race anywhere else in the province. Is a Conservative 10 to 12 point lead or more everywhere in the province outside of the city of Toronto, including the GTA.
Sure, but then, within pockets, so we'll have another conversation getting into ridings. And averages are misleading, right? Because there's very few average ridings. Right. So if you're going into like Southwest Ontario is a favorite of mine for this, right? Because you're comparing, Windsor to Bruce County, and it's just nuts, right? So within Toronto, we're comparing Rosedale or, Spadina to Scarborough Centre or Etobicoke Centre or North York, right? And they're all different. And the patterns are different, right? So we see, some Liberal Tory races, and we also see some Liberal NDP races. And that's really the problem for the Liberals in Toronto, and that they're strong everywhere. Whereas, the downtown area is good for the NDP, and the suburbs are good for the Tories. So if you see an even race, it means the Liberals are getting slaughtered because they're going to lose to the NDP downtown and they're going to lose to the Tories in the suburb. But, that's how it starts. If they can pick up, right, and get a 10-point lead, then they can start winning everywhere.
Right.
And that's why we actually, when our 9 regions, we actually divide the city of Toronto into 2, right? We have the downtown core as one area, and we have the suburbs as a second, because those suburbs vote differently.
Why do you think nobody can compete with the Conservatives in rural ridings anymore?
Well, I think the bottom line is that the average rural voter doesn't think that the Liberals or NDP care about them anymore. And there's a variety of issues related to that. But, treating everyone who owns a gun as a criminal doesn't help. There's just, saying that people should take the bus when you live in the country doesn't help. Just the nature of the culture there, right? It's an older white culture. And so a lot of the identity politics and things like that don't sound like they care about me. You may not be opposed to it, but it's not your issue. It's not your bread and butter. And so all the time spent on apologizing for this or apologizing for that is time that's not spent talking about the things I care about. And so, like, if you think about the federal Liberals, in that 2015 election, when they were talking about the escalator app, lots of people in rural Ontario would have felt an identity with that. But as the federal Liberals talk more and more about identity politics and equity and social justice, it just sort of left them cold. Not entirely, but more or less. So there's definitely if we look for cultural alienation, which doesn't exist in Canada the way it exists in the US or Europe, but exists, the cultural alienation you're going to find more of in rural Canada.
Thanks. That's really smart. Interesting. Listen, Greg, the more than an hour has flown by, and there's a lot more in this, and I suspect we're going to come back and talk some more before this campaign is out. And I want to really thank you and your company personally for lending your data to the Curse of Politics and the Herle Burly. It's really helpful to our listeners. Is there anything that you are seeing out there that you think we haven't touched on that you think people should hear about?
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting to me, and we haven't really got into it in this one, but I'm sure we'll talk about it another time. I'm really interested in looking at the electorate through the prism of values. values, right? So what we know about voters is that voters don't know a lot about a lot of things, but they can learn. What voters do know, though, is what they think is right or wrong in a wide variety of areas. And that's what we mean when we talk about values. What are the outcomes that are important to you? What's the right or the wrong way to proceed to get those outcomes? People have a wide variety of values, and they're quite consistent over time. And so I group people by their shared values, because that's a way of understanding what sort of policies parties can do that would appeal, and it's a way of understanding election mandates. Well, when you look at people by groups of values, historically what we've seen, there are two groups that have small L liberal values, the business liberals and the left liberals. There's a really interesting, somewhat left-wing group that's populist and is fiscally conservative. So they want strong social programs, but they don't want to run up a debt to pay for it. They want to run up taxes to pay for it, that we call the thrifty moderates. Then there's the core left group, which is the natural liberal NDP base. And then there are two conservative clusters. And consistently what we've seen in Ontario is that the Liberals clearly dominate the two small L liberal clusters, usually win the thrifty moderates. And when they're doing well, they also steal the core left from the NDP. And then the Tories usually win the populist conservatives and the deferential conservatives, but occasionally the Liberals come close with the deferential conservatives. In this election, the Liberals are not winning a single vote cluster. They're not winning the sort of Sheila Copps left voters. They're not winning left liberal voters. They're not winning the Paul Martin business liberals. The Tories are winning not just the two conservative groups. The Tories are winning the business liberals, and the Tories are winning the thrifty moderates, which could go to any party. The NDP are winning the core left with half the core left, the NDP or the Liberals getting only half what the NDP is getting. And the left Liberals are basically a three-way race, where currently right now the NDP is winning the left Liberals. So you really, when you look at this, you know, the number one job, and it's completely related to party ID, is for the Liberals to remind people that share their value and feel closer to the Liberal Party. They need to come up with a reason for people to remember that's who they are and who they ought to vote for. And so I'm really looking, so thematically, you can clearly see where the Tories are going, and you can clearly see where the NDP is going. But so far, we haven't really seen a clear message from the Liberals that is, this is why you need us in this election. And if we don't see that soon, if all we get from the Liberals are tactics, specific announcements that don't drive a larger story, then I think that this is probably going to be a romp for the Tories with an interesting threat for the NDP. So I'm really watching for that. And if we can't talk about that next week, it's probably over for the Liberals.
Well, that is a very tantalizing and interesting, if sobering for some of us, note on which to end. Greg, I want to thank you for your time. I'm sure you're busy. If you're out in Vancouver, you're working. And thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing your data, as I said, and your insight around the data, more importantly. It's been a very thoughtful conversation. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN. So, we'll be back next week with another Herle Burly. Not sure who we'll have. We'll figure it out between now and then. But Greg, Lyle, we'll keep talking to you through the election campaign and keep feeding us data. Thank you very much. And Herle Burly, we'll catch you next week.